Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you the first part of my review series on the new Sony a7R Mark IV. Today what we're going to do is we're going to do an overview of what's changed compared to the a7R III, what hasn't changed, and what should have changed. And so we're going to break those things down. We're going to take a look at the build, some of the specs, the handling, some of the feature set, and then in future episodes we'll examine in more detail autofocus performance. We will also examine sensor performance and give you a final verdict on how everything shakes out with the new a7R Mark IV. Now, as far as what has stayed the same, both of these have built-in steady shot, which is the in-body image stabilization. It's rated at 5.5 stops, so no real spec change there. We'll hope there's maybe a few tweaks to its performance to improve it a bit. Impressively, although Sony has dramatically increased the resolution of this camera from 42.4 megapixels to 61 megapixels, they've managed to retain the 10 frames per second of the a7R III, complete with full-time tracking as a part of that. An impressive accomplishment when you consider how much data is running through the architecture there. So good stuff there. Via firmware update, they added interval shooting, for time lapses into the a7R Mark III. Of course, it's natively in the a7 IV. Video specs are about the same. There is one minor spec change, and that really comes to video AF. Through firmware update, we got real-time face tracking during video on the a7R Mark III. On the a7R IV, that's further refined to full-time eye tracking as a part of that, and so obviously an improvement there. As far as the specs and the codecs, though, we're remaining the same. We top out at 4K, 30 frames per second, and a maximum bit rate of 100. And then at full HD, you max out at 120 frames per second. And so, no real improvements to point to there. There is some claim that, that footage is somewhat improved, that there's a better job in terms of, pixel binning and all of that to get cleaner results. We're going to look at footage side by side in future episodes to see if that's actually true. Beyond that, what hasn't changed is the touchscreen, and the touchscreen is the same resolution, same size. It's still 3 inches. It's still 1.44 million dots, and its touchscreen capability, unfortunately, is no better, which means that you get the ability to touch to focus. Works fairly well. You can move the focus point around. No menu navigation, none of that good stuff, and so that's unfortunate. It retains the FZ100 battery that became standard with the A7, or actually with the A9 and then into the a7R Mark III. a7 III seems to be their new standard moving ahead. Now, while there is, as we'll see in a moment, some difference in the way that the side ports are configured, we have the same outputs in terms of microphone input, 3.5 millimeter, and then headphone output, also 3.5 millimeter. And so those have stayed the same. So what's changed? Well, what has changed, of course, above all, is resolution. There are, at 61 megapixels, there are basically 32% more pixels, or the a7R III has only 68% of the pixels that the a7R IV has. Now, there is both a huge asset to this, and then there is a huge liability. We'll get the asset first. The asset is in crop mode. It has the ability to, of course, they've had crop mode for a while, 18 megapixels on the a7R III. Because of the higher resolution, that jumps to 26.2 megapixels, which is actually higher resolution than any of the current Sony APS-C camera bodies. And so this is actually, if you want highest APS-C resolution, it's actually found on the a7R Mark IV, a full-frame camera. Beyond that, they have managed to keep in 325 phase detect points across, so you have great coverage for tracking. And then another huge asset, number one, it's an asset that they managed to retain 68 compressed raw buffer depth on the a7R IV, which makes it compatible or comparable to the a7R III, even with the lower resolution there. But really cool for crop mode is that the buffer depth grows from 68 compressed RAWs to 204 in crop mode, which means that you've got a huge amount of buffer for shooting action, sports, wildlife in crop mode. It's very, very tempting. And in fact, so tempting that my thought is that if I do make an upgrade to the a7R4, I would actually sell the a7R3 along with the a6500 I'm filming on at the moment and combine into one camera, and this be my body for testing APS-C lenses and also for shooting kind of in those sports oriented, and I would pair that with an A9, which I've actually got on the way right now. There's also improvement when it comes to autofocus. First of all, that takes the form of more autofocus points, 567 phase detect points that cover 99% of the height of the sensor and 74% of the width. I calculate that as a total coverage of 86.5% of the whole sensor is covered with many autofocus points. So that's great. That's versus 399 phase detect points on the a7R4, which had about 68% sensor coverage. So basically what we've done is we've brought this in line with not only the A9, but also the a7RIII, which kind of corrects the, the liability that the more expensive a7R3 had a somewhat poorer focus system than the a7RIII, which is much cheaper as a camera. And so, of course, that makes more sense. And so also there's a newer image processor and better autofocus algorithms that allows for better real-time tracking, what they call AI tracking. And so I can attest to the fact that already I've seen an improvement with adapted lenses, for example. And for example, I threw on the Canon 100-400L Mark II. Any telephoto lens adapted is a challenge. And there was some, and I used a Sigma MC11, and there were some wild turkeys in the backyard. And I found that, tracking actually worked quite well. It was snappy, it seemed to focus well, and so I'm impressed with the improvement that I see there. Another thing that they have changed is that with the a7R3, they introduced pixel shift, which allowed the sensor to, on a tripod, sensor to move one pixel in each direction for images. You can combine that together in post and get a really, really high resolution end result. Has limited applications. You need something that's not moving because that would ruin it, but certainly applications where you could get massive amounts of resolution. a7R4 takes that to a whole new level. It moves the sensor in only half stop increments, but you can shoot up to 16 different frames. You can combine an image of up to like 240 megapixels, massive amounts of resolution. The downside in both applications, however, is that you cannot combine that in camera, which would be tremendously useful. You have to combine it in post, and at the moment you can only do it in Sony's own imaging software, which, for many of us means that it's an extra stop along the way in the processing workflow. Byproduct of that is I haven't really used, in 2 years of owning the a7R3, I haven't really used pixel shift. I don't know that I'll use it on the a7R4 either, but anyway, it's there if you need it. Hot shoe here has been updated. They call it a multi-interface input, but it's a hot shoe. But it's been updated for more compatibility with some new accessories like microphones, and so an upgrade there. A major upgrade is to the viewfinder itself. The viewfinder has gone from 3.6 million dots resolution to 5.7, and so a huge increase in resolution. What that means is that a couple of things. First of all, if you look in the viewfinder, it's a much better, more realistic experience, more engaging experience. Closer to an optical viewfinder, not quite there yet, but of course there's some huge advantages of the EVF approach. In this case, particularly if you're shooting in crop mode, the ability to overlay information, lots of stuff there. But certainly, it is a huge improvement. I also really love it. Second place I really love it is if I'm magnifying the image to manual focus. More resolution means that as you zoom in, you're not losing as much resolution, which means it's still very clear to visually confirm focus. So if I'm shooting with actual manual glass, that's huge, because I vastly prefer that visual confirmation to focus overlays personally, and so I find that it works really well for me. If you're going from an a7RIII viewfinder, which is somewhere around 2 million dot inch, to this, nearly 3 times as high resolution, it is a night and day experience. Very, very impressive there. One other thing under the hood that they've improved is the wireless tethering. And the wireless tethering, before you had to be wired if you wanted to send images. Now it's improved wireless tethering over either 2.4 or 5.6 gigahertz networks. So you can send to a laptop, to a tablet. And for some of you, particularly in your application, that's going to be a really, really great improvement there. And so obviously no need for any kind of Wi-Fi type card or something to transmit, or some accessory. You can do it from in camera. That's a nice thing there. There are some physical improvements, some significant ones that we'll take a look at in more detail. Let's jump in and take a look at that. So the biggest improvement between the a7R IV and the a7R III is the grip. And as you can see, the grip is considerably deeper. I'll give you a look at with my, if I hold the a7R III, you'll see that there's basically, because of the grip depth and the size of my hand, there is no room for my pinky to go. There's just, I can't mount it on there. Without making it a whole lot bigger, they have increased the grip size to where I can actually get all of my fingers on there. I would still probably add a bit of a grip extender for maximum comfort for myself, but this feels much more like a real camera in hand and less like a camera that you're kind of hanging on to, as in the case of the a7R Mark III. And so I think that that's a big improvement. It's actually only a little less than 4 millimeters deeper in terms of the depth of the camera, but that 4 millimeters makes a huge difference. Physically, there's only a 1 millimeter difference in the overall height of the camera. So it's impressive the way that they have done that. So let's take a quick overview as to what has changed here physically. One improvement, if we look on the side where all the ports are, is that the same basic stuff is there, but this initial design is sloppy. I mean, it's always in your way, the way that these dangle down. Also, you know, you can tell that this isn't the best sealed situation in the world. They don't always, you know, fit in there perfectly tight. And so that was a liability. In this case, we have got much more precise feeling and better closing spaces. It doesn't just dangle around. You can see it's designed to seal better. And so when it sits in there, it's much tighter. And these in particular are actual more like doors as opposed to just flaps that hang around. And again, they're designed with better seals inside. You've got a little bit, you know, more logical design there, but the biggest improvement is the precision, where it's still not, I don't think it's as good as like my Canon 5D Mark IV for that, but it's much, much better. On the other side also, we have got a more, listen to that click, a more precise battery, or not, excuse me, but memory card door. It's better designed than what was here, where you had kind of like again, a flip out, but you can tell along the sides, the seals are not the best. Whereas in this case, you can see everything is raised and there are slots inside for it to click into and to seal into. And these are all like rubberized gaskets in here. So you can definitely tell the weather sealing is improved. Another improvement here is now both of these slots are UHS 2 compatible. And the other thing is that they've made the top slot number 1, the bottom slot number 2, which of course is logical. Instead of having 2 on the top and 1 on the bottom. You know, your one kind of downside there is that it's going to take a mental ergonomic adjustment. And so anyway, looking at the top here, it's basically the same. Everything is the same in terms of what but there are some tweaks to how everything works. And so first of all, the mode dial is probably the most similar thing here. And so again, you have to hold down that to make changes. The rear wheel has been improved in terms of both its feel and its accessibility. It's actually raised up so it's easier to find rather than just kind of almost sitting flush there. That's an improvement. Now, when it comes to the way that the exposure compensation is handled, it's more like Fuji in that you have an actual lock that you can leave unlocked. And so if you say, well, I don't want a lock there, no problem, you leave it unlocked. If you have a problem with inadvertently moving that, you can lock it down and it will stay there. A little bit of a change in the C2 and C1 buttons. There was a ridge to differentiate them because, as we're going to see, buttons were kind of flush and without a whole lot of travel on them. On the a7R IV, the buttons are much higher raised and more definite feeling. There's more travel to them, so they're a lot easier to find just in a tactile way. There's also improvements to the feel of the on-off switch. It's more precise, it's a little bit more robust, a little thicker. The other thing too, which is kind of a subtle but cool improvement, is that this front wheel, while it doesn't feel a whole lot different than the one on the a7R III, it's actually canted up a little bit Now, that actually makes it easier to find ergonomically, and so it is another nice improvement there. The bottom is pretty much the same, very, very little change there. There is more sealing that's gone on underneath. Now, there is some tweaks here, however, to the back. So first of all, you can see all of these buttons are raised up a lot higher. There's much more travel, and so in some ways they feel spongy, not in a negative sense though, but in the fact that they're soft, but you can feel a definite travel to them as opposed to being almost flush. I find the one that stands out the most for me is the AF on button that I primarily also use to magnify the image with manual glass. Before, it wasn't easy to find because it's very flush and there's not a lot of feel to it. It's now raised up. It's got this little hub raised up and it's really definite. It's great to use. And it's amazing how much of a difference something like that makes. But all of these buttons have an improved feel all around. They're just more, definite feeling, more travel to them. Minor tweaks to this wheel. It doesn't feel as different to me. But of course, the other major difference here is to the thumbstick. And the thumbstick is more definite feeling, but it's also got a much better grip pattern that feels better and also feels more substantial and precise. And so the camera feels better in hand, the buttons feel better in operation, the dials for the most part feel improved. They were already making, good improvements on the ergonomics. This is a big step in the right direction. So definitely love the new grip, big improvement there, and I still probably would add a grip extender to it just because I have good size hands, but at the same time it actually feels like a real camera in hand now. Wow, with all of that without growing really all that much, so kudos to Sony for that. Now, as far as stuff that should have changed that hadn't, the big thing here is that you've got 61 megapixels of resolution. Great. But you've only got one option on how to control it when it comes to RAW, and that's either to choose between compressed or uncompressed RAW images. There is no MRAW, there's no SRAW. In other words, there are no options to shoot at lower resolution in RAW. You can do it in JPEG, but not in RAW. That's a serious liability because my experience is that most photographers, most of the time, do not need 61 megapixels. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad that it's there for when I need it. But I also want the option to shoot at lower resolutions, to shoot somewhere around 30 megapixels, for example. A wedding photographer that's coming home with 1,500 raw images, they don't really want 1,500 raw 61 megapixel images. That's going to take forever to run through their computer, both in, maybe turning them into DNGs and then to process them. It's just a lot of unnecessary pixels for most applications. And for Sony to persist in not including an option to parse that down to a smaller size is, at this stage, kind of unconscionable, considering that their alternatives from Canon and Nikon have had those as options going back as long as I can remember. Furthermore, at least as far as Canon goes, for a long time now, going back to the 70D, they have had fully functional touchscreens that allow you to use them for pretty much everything. Navigating menus, touch to focus, touch to shoot. It's just, and they're faster and more responsive. Sony is capable of giving us a better touchscreen than what they are. And I would rather see them go back in a future model and address some of the ergonomic basics than to give us a bunch more features without addressing the obvious stuff. Sony is great at innovation. They're not always great at just dealing with the practical stuff. And it's the practical stuff that I find to be the greatest liability here. One other minor beef I've already discussed, no 4K 60 there. That's something for sure. The other thing is that I would love to see built-in GPS. Still, if you want location information for your photos, it's by linking to your smartphone. My experience to this point with all Sony cameras that I've tested is that it works intermittently. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Some shots have information, some don't, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to when it will work and when it won't work. And so I prefer an in-camera solution. I can live with that though. At the end of the day, as we're going to see as we move ahead, there's a lot good here. This is really probably the most mature mirrorless camera on the market, and I think what Sony is doing, and the reason why they're releasing this only 2 years after the a7R III, this was already kind of the gold standard. I think they're just kind of pushing the bar further ahead to try to make sure that Canon and Nikon don't even get a foot in the door in the mirrorless market share, and so I think that's why we've got this at this point. Stay tuned, of course. We'll examine to see whether those resolution improvements have come with any hit to either high ISO or dynamic range. We'll see how that plays out. We'll see how the added autofocus, how much of a difference that actually makes, and I'll give you a final verdict, so stay tuned for all that. In the meantime, look in the description down below. Lots of, there's linkage to my photo gallery there where I'm shooting with some of the new glass, like some of the new Sigma lenses, 14-24. I'll also be shooting with the 35 1.2. Haven't done it yet, but that's the next thing I'm moving to. And some of the new Tamron lenses I'll shoot on there, some of the new Samyang, and then of course Sony lenses, some adapted lenses. So, take a look at all of that. Beyond that, also there's buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. And my experience is that demand outstrips supply early on for these new Sony cameras. So, you might want to get your pre-order in if you're interested in buying one. And also there's linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.